What is science and what is religion? Both are attempts to try to find the truth about our physical reality and what is inside or outside of that reality and what the rules are. In the simulation hypothesis, what science is actually discovering is what we in the video game world would call a physics engine. The simulation hypothesis as a model that we live in an information-based reality that's being rendered for each of us may end up coming closer to explaining these things than a lot of other models that are out there.
Hey there, I'm Derek Bernard, producer of the Hacker Noon podcast. Today I sit down with Hacker Noon contributing author Riz Virk to discuss his recently published book, The Simulation Hypothesis. In a world where the nature of our being in this place we call reality is so often taken for granted amidst the need to sustain the status quo, Riz explores the very real possibility, and in some schools of thought the very real probability, that what we experience as real is in fact a simulation akin to a video game with its quests, achievements, and leveling up through our experiences. One last thing. Hacker Noon's first annual Noonie Awards is open and awaiting your votes, and the last day to submit yours is August 20th. Lots of great categories to vote on at noonies.hackernoon.com. Riz starts us off here. Check it out. Hacker Noon, an independent tech media destination for tech professionals and the tech interested, released its new publishing platform at hackernoon.com. Anyone can now visit hackernoon.com, start writing, and have their post reviewed and improved by a professional editor for distribution via Hacker Noon. Head over to hackernoon.com, resist the urge to dive into all the great content, then click Get Started to create a free account and start writing. You're just a few clicks away from becoming a contributing author. See you soon at hackernoon.com.
And that's one of the real big mysteries in quantum physics, which is this idea of quantum entanglement, this idea that two particles can be entangled so that whatever affects one affects the other. And despite where you are in the universe, you can theoretically have information about what's going on in the other place. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance.
Right.
And no one really knows why it occurs. But there was a set of experiments done recently by a group of physicists where they simulated a scaled-down version of the universe. And they found that by entangling certain particles, they could reduce the amount of information that they needed to keep track of all of space-time. So it's possible that quantum entanglement is a way of maintaining information in the universe. Now, I'm a video game designer, and so I look at it and say, well, it could very much be an optimization technique. And the history of video games is about optimization. I mean, if you looked at video games in the 80s and there was no way they could render a full 3D world like World of Warcraft or Fortnite, they just wouldn't have enough processing power to handle all those pixels. So what happened between then and now? What happened is that many computer scientists came up with these optimization techniques and rendering techniques and compression techniques. I mean, the reason I can stream Game of Thrones on my iPod or my iPad is because not all the pixels have to be sent over the air. So what happens is when you compress information, you take all the redundant information and you reduce it. So in a scene of winter, all the pixels that are white, they all pretty much have the same value, right? Well, the simulation hypothesis would say that the quantum entanglement is an optimization technique to reduce the amount of information and data that we need to have in order to render the physical world. And there have been, some physicists like Jim Gates, who's I think at the University of Maryland, who's a string theorist, and he says he's found error correction codes, in the underlying equations in string theory. Now, why would there be error codes underlying physical reality? Well, we use error codes all the time in computer science and in video games. We use them when we compress data. And then when we uncompress data, we want to make sure we got the same information. And so we can use error correction codes. So that, all ties to this idea that some of the biggest mysteries, that being one of them, make more sense when we think of the world as a simulated reality and less as a physical reality.
And so let me see if I get it straight. So the universe is like 14 billion years old, they say, right? And it all came from a kind of bang of some kind, potentially, right? And then so in that time from the inception until now, all of those billions of years, evolution has happened probably multiple times, many times across many epochs, I would imagine, where civilization evolves to a point where they can duplicate a reality so precisely that it would feel like the real thing.
That's right. And in fact, one of the reasons why this idea is taken more seriously now. So if you go back to when The Matrix came out, which was, almost exactly 20 years ago. So I released, my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, on the 20-year anniversary of the release of The Matrix on March 31st. 2019 versus 1999 is when The Matrix was released. So back then, it was pretty much considered science fiction or philosophy. And today, many scientists and academics take it more seriously. And one of the reasons why is there's a professor at Oxford named Nick Bostrom, and he came up with a paper in 2003 that says, "Are you living in a computer simulation?" And his argument pretty much says that if any civilization anywhere gets to what I call the simulation point, the point at which we can reproduce a reality that is indistinguishable from physical reality, and I'll tell you later why I think we're going to be there soon anyway. His point was either civilization never gets there or it gets there. And if it gets there, then they can create many new simulations. All you need to do is just crank up a new server.
An infinite number even.
An infinite number. And each of those can have billions, if not trillions of beings. So depending on the computing power, right? And I think, he estimated that you would need the computing power. If you had the computing power of a whole planet, you could simulate the entire history of the human race within, I forget what the time frame was, but it wasn't very long with that much computing power. But the idea is that if that's true, then there are many more simulated beings than there are real physical beings, right? There's trillions and trillions of them. And in the physical universe, there might only be billions of them, right? On, sort of one physical universe, if you will, or trillions. But we don't necessarily, although this is up for debate as well, but within the base physical reality, there's a lot less beings than there are simulated beings. And so if you just do a simple statistic and you say, okay, if you're a being, right, which we are, we think we are anyway,
right,
you're more likely to be a simulated being than a physical being.
A non-player character.
Exactly, a non-player character. And so what most people don't realize, there's two versions of the simulation hypothesis. I mean, there's actually more than two, but I like to divide it in these two broad categories. And again, coming from the world of video games. So the NPC version, which says that we're all like non-player characters in video games. And that is what's implied in Bostrom's simulation argument. Because if you're just spinning up a new server with a trillion new beings, they're all just information and they're just simulated beings. So we're all NPCs or AI. In the other version, the PC, the player character version, we all exist, or at least some subset of us, exist outside the simulation. Just as when I play a character in World of Warcraft, I exist in this biological reality, but I have my character that I'm role-playing inside the 3D virtual world. And so that's more like the Matrix, right? So if you remember in the Matrix, when Keanu Reeves' character Neo, gets the choice from Morpheus, who is very aptly named after the Greek god of dreams, of taking the red pill and the blue pill in the very famous scene. Even people that haven't seen the movie know the scene now. And he takes the red pill and he wakes up outside of the simulated reality. And in this case, he wakes up in a pod. And there's a whole nother backstory there, which brings up this question of what's outside the simulation. But those are the two broad categories of the simulation.
So I guess, and you say two broad categories, does that mean it has to be either or?
Well,
it can't be both simultaneously, or?
It could be both. And so, there's an overlap there because in the player character version, there are definitely going to be some NPCs as well, right?
Has to be.
And
if you're an NPC in one reality, then who's the player character?
Right. And so, recently there was a big gaming conference in LA, E3, and, Elon Musk was there, and he's one of the big proponents of the simulation theory. And he asked a question when he was asked about this. He said, well, whose avatar are you, right? And the idea is that our simulated reality has great graphics, We don't all like the storylines that we're given.
Right.
And so one of the objections I get from people is say, well, if this was a simulated reality, if this is a video game, I'd make myself, a trillionaire and I'd have this great life. And I would say to that, well, why is it that we play video games in the first place? Right? We play video games to have experiences that we might not be able to have in our base reality outside.
It's a kind of escape.
It's a kind of escape, right? I mean, I can't fly a dragon, right, in real life.
Totally.
Right? Or shoot
so it's a call
bullets.
to adventure also.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a call to adventure. But then there are games like Second Life and The Sims where you're just living out a virtual life, getting married, you're doing all kinds of things. And so, you have to understand the nature of the game. In fact, let's go back to science fiction. I always like to do that because I think, it's hard to talk about this topic without talking about some science fiction.
Yeah.
But in The Matrix, if you remember, in the sequels, which, were not as well received as
they were just all right.
Yeah.
They touched on some pretty cool themes, but I think they missed the mark for the most part. So.
Yeah, in terms of just fun movies to watch. But one of the revelations that came out, and I had to go back and rewatch this, was that they said that in their first version of The Matrix they created, everything was great. There were no problems.
Right.
And that the human mind failed to accept that as a reality. And so the people kept waking up in their pods. And so when they introduced some element of challenges or even drudgery into, the virtual lives of the characters, the human mind accepted it more. And so, again, it gets back to this idea, we talked about adventures. Indiana Jones is one of my favorite, sets of adventure movies. And what if he was just given a map to the treasure at the beginning and all you had to do was go get it? Well, that would make for a very boring movie, right?
Totally.
There have to be some challenges along the way. And I think that's, part of the game itself. And so it depends on what type of game it is, really, I think.
And then, it seems to tie in definitely into spirituality or because, I think about the simulated reality and then immediately I go, well, how would one hack the system? And it seems like if you look at, say, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he seems to give you the instruction manual right there,
That's right. And I think the simulation hypothesis is one that's very consistent with various religious traditions, particularly the Eastern traditions of Buddhism and Hinduism. And, part of the core tenets there is that we have Maya or illusion around us. Buddha himself said, know all things to be like this, a mirage, right? That they are like reflections in a very clear mirror, devoid of inherent existence, right? And that some people get to the point of peeking outside the simulation and telling us what's there. And so it's almost tailor-made. And then, in the Eastern traditions, you have this idea of reincarnation and karma. And so you come back and you play different roles. And the way that works, and it's symbolized by Buddha's endless wheel of wandering, or samsara as they call it, is that every time you play a character, you have certain tasks that have to be done, which is just like a video game, right? You
Totally.
have quests and achievements. But what's interesting is that this is almost a never-ending stream of quests. So as you play the game, you create additional quests and achievements for yourself, which you then have to take care of in your karmic debts in future role-playing characters. And the idea is that eventually you can get off and stop playing the game at some point, but only when you stop creating more things for yourself to do in this game. So in the Eastern traditions, there's almost a very good fit. In fact, in the Hindu Vedas, which date back 5,000 years or more, nobody knows the exact date.
Right.
They talk about the Leela, which is the grand play, like a stage play of life. And they talk about dreams and, the god Vishnu is dreaming this reality as one age and we're all inside of it. But today, if we were to come up with a metaphor, we might not say stage play. That's what Shakespeare said, right? All life's a stage and we're merely players, but we might say, well, it's an interactive play. It's one where we have some free will and we can change things. We may have to live with our consequences. Well, that sounds a lot more like an interactive video game, than a scripted play that might be there. And so I think from a spiritual perspective, they've been seeking truth for thousands of years. And then, science has been around for a few hundred years. And we've been looking, in that realm for what is the truth of existence. And every time physicists have tried to come up with a material reality, and they look at it and they open it up and they can't find the damn thing, right? They can't find where is physical reality, right? I mean, we know, molecules have atoms, but molecules have spaces in between them. And then you open up the atom and it's like 99.99%, maybe even more nines than that, empty space, right?
Infinite.
And then you go down to the subatomic particles and you look for the electrons, and they're not really there. And so it seems that with physics as well, they can't find a physical reality. And there's a great quote from a well-known physicist from the 20th century named John Wheeler. And he was one of the last to work with Einstein and many of the giants of quantum physics. And, he said that in his lifetime, and I think he passed away, I think it was in the 90s, or it wasn't that long ago. So he saw much of the 20th century evolution of physics. And he said physics went through three phases. In the first phase, they thought everything was a particle, which ties to this idea of material reality, that everything is a physical object. Then he said we thought everything was a field of probabilities. And that's where quantum physics comes into play. And this idea that an electron is not just a particle, but it's a wave of possibilities and probabilities. We can talk more about that in a minute. And he goes, in this third phase, he realized that at its core, everything is actually information. That when you get right down to it, this idea of a bit, and I don't think he lived long enough to see quantum computing really come into its own, which it is in this decade, and hopefully the next decade. But this idea of a qubit, which is a bit that can be both 0 and 1, has come into play. So anyway, he came up with a phrase, which he mentioned in his autobiography, of it from bit. It being the physical world and bit being the information of 0 or 1. He said everything in the physical world actually consists of information. And so, we keep having this idea that you have information and then you have mathematical rules that the world follows. That sounds a lot more like a computer-generated reality than a physical reality.
And it seems like, I always come back to, it seems like all of that and the information, and this is kind of where I got stuck actually with the whole hypothesis, is you talk about downloading consciousness into a system and then living on forever in the form of information, right? And to me, it seems like, well, how do you download consciousness? And once you've translated that consciousness into information, it becomes soulless, right? You can't break information's heart, so it's like, how does one exist as human in a place like that?
Yeah, well, I think, this gets to some fundamental questions of, what does it mean to be human? And, coming back to science fiction, this is a theme that was explored by Philip K. Dick in a lot of his work. Blade Runner, the movie, which is based on his novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, came to this question of, what is human? Are the androids alive? And I'm a big fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I watched growing up, and they always had that question with Data, who was an android but a member of the crew. Was he just property of Starfleet, or was he a being, as Captain Picard argued, in his own right, who has his own rights? And it's a question that we're going to have to struggle with here in our physical reality as well, pretty soon, because AI is becoming pretty good. So one of the things that I do in the book, about a third of the book is dedicated to the computer science, and I lay out what I call the stages to the simulation point. And those stages start with video games, basic text adventures, and then graphical adventures, and then 3D adventures. You get to virtual reality and augmented reality, which is where we are today. And then they go into machine and brain interfaces, kind of like in The Matrix, where when Keanu Reeves woke up, he had a physical wire connected, into his neocortex, right? It's probably why they call him Neo. But that's where the information was beamed into, but he still existed outside the information. And then AI that can pass the Turing test, which Alan Turing defined, he called it the imitation game. Which was this idea that you would be talking to a person and a machine behind the curtains. And back in those days, he said you would use teletype to send messages. Today, we might say you use, text messages or just voice messages. And he said, if you can't tell the difference between the machine, today we would say the AI, the software, but back then they thought of it as a machine, and the person, then that would pass, that particular version of the Turing test. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And my estimate is that by 2100, we'll be through most of the stages of the simulation point. Even if we're off by 100 years, certainly by 2200.
Yeah.
Which means if we can get there really, computers have only been around since the 1950s. That would be, 150 to 250 years. Think of a civilization that was, millions of years ahead of us and has had computers for 10,000 years. What could they have achieved in that time frame?
Totally.
And so getting to that, I didn't really answer your question about the information and the soulless, but I think it's a question that, we're going to have to struggle with. Now, the question is, is there a soul that comes in and inhabits our body, which is what the religions have been telling us all along. And if so, what is that information? And this is where, if you look at again, back to the Eastern traditions, and we can talk about the Western religious traditions as well, but in Hinduism and Buddhism, there's actually a little bit of a debate. So in Hinduism, there's this idea of an eternal soul that comes in, plays a role in a body, and goes to the next one, etc. And it exists outside as an independent entity. In the Buddhist version, what is this thing that reincarnates? What is it that gets downloaded? And there's, as far as God is concerned, Buddha never said anything about it. He kind of said, "Oh, I'm not talking about that. I'm just telling you about the mechanism."
Yeah.
But he said that what gets downloaded is actually more like a bag of karma. So what's a bag of karma? Getting back
collection of algorithms, almost.
Exactly. A collection of information and algorithms for processing that information. And, one of the sections in the book is called "Is Buddha's Endless Wheel an Algorithm?" Right? Do you really need the lords of karma? Now coming back.
But wait. So the karma, that would, it transforms something. It transforms a being, right? All of that information that gets downloaded into this, there's something that occurs to it, right? And grows it, changes it into whatever, releases its karma into a dharmic state or something.
Right. And the idea is that, if you think of karma, and this is, my contention with the video game analogy, as a series of quests and achievements. We think of karma in the West as, okay, person A killed person B in one lifetime. Therefore, what comes around goes around, and person B to kill person A. It's a little more subtle than that. It's more about
I don't see it that way.
Right. Yeah. And so people that have studied it, understand that it's more about specific feelings and emotions and as well as events that have happened, and that those events need to kind of resolve themselves. And so, if you think of it like a computer algorithm, you have a stack of things that's getting added on, and then eventually you want to empty the stack, right? You want to take those things off. And those are the things that are used metaphorically now by the lords of karma to create situations for us.
That's the never-ending cycle.
Right. Could be a never-ending cycle. But the idea within the Eastern religions is to try to wake up to that. In fact, there's a whole sect of Buddhist dream yoga, which talks about learning to wake up inside a dream and realize that the dream is an illusion. And if you develop that process, it's one of the 6 yogas of Naropa, which is preserved in one of the Tibetan traditions, that if you can do it while you're dreaming, then you can also, when you're awake, realize that all of this is like a shared dream. It's like a physical reality constructed from a dream world, and that there's a part of us, something about us that's outside this reality, and that we can get back in touch with that. And so that's why, one of the reasons that I like simulation hypothesis is because it bridges the gap between religion and science. What happened like 500 years ago, with Galileo and the church, right? In the Western traditions, the church was trying to suppress science in many ways. And so many scientists became afraid of that. Then we had, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all of these things. And today we're almost at the point where the opposite is true, where the scientists are saying, forget religion, that stuff is a bunch of crap, right? We know it's a physical world and this is a material model and we're studying the equations, and none of that stuff, is true. And if you talk about it, well, then you can't, be taken seriously. You can't get right. Academic environment, right? So it's almost like flipped, right?
It's like the religious lens is in the way of science in a way.
Right. But if you think of it at their core, what is science and what is religion? Both are attempts to try to find the truth about our physical reality and what is inside or outside of that reality and what the rules are, right? In the simulation hypothesis, what science is actually discovering is what we in the video game world would call a physics engine, right? Which are the rules that are followed by everything within a video game, and there's precise mathematical rules in a physics engine. But within a video game, you can also, if you've played like Second Life or various virtual reality games, you can walk from point A to point B, or you can teleport from point A to point. You can instantly go from one place to another. And so, there's been a lot of theorizing about wormholes and ways to teleport across space-time, and we're still discovering the rules of that. But I think it's possible that we've discovered only 5% of the rules of the physical universe. Certainly, we've only discovered, I think, something like 4% of the mass of the universe. The rest, they just lump under dark matter and dark energy. And we don't really know what those things are. Right?
Yeah, there's kind of this question of we don't know what we don't know. And I wonder, it seems like we'd be just completely blown away if we actually discovered what we didn't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, could they have imagined 200 years ago some of the weirdness of quantum physics? And so the other big question in quantum physics is quantum indeterminacy, and superposition, which is this idea that there's a probability wave of where a particle could be, and then that collapses to a single reality when it's observed.
Just the double slit.
Yeah, the most famous version of this is the double slit experiment, where a particle can only go through one of these two slits, right? It has to go here to point A or to point B. But a wave, is a set of probabilities, and so the particle goes through all of those, whether it's a photon or an electron, and it appears as an interference pattern on the screen beyond the slits. Probably an easier way to understand it for most people is Schrodinger's cat, right? And
that's an easy way to understand it?
Easier.
Okay.
Which I think Niels Bohr said, if someone isn't shocked by quantum physics, then they haven't really understood it, right?
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, exactly. It just seems nonsensical. But the idea with Schrodinger's cat is that you have a cat inside a box with a radioactive material, and after an hour, there's a 50% chance the cat is alive and 50% chance the cat is dead. Now, we would say, and it makes total common sense to us, that the cat is either alive or dead. I just don't know because I haven't looked. But it can't be both. It's one or the other. Quantum physics says no, it's in a state of superposition, which is that it's both alive and dead, and it's not until we actually observe it that one of those realities, the probability wave, collapses, and one of those realities takes shape. Now, that's kind of weird, right, to say that both of those exist. And
it's godlike if you think about it,
right.
in its essence.
Because
you've created your reality just by observing it.
Right. And did you create your reality? This is an interesting question, right? And then some people have done gyrations and come up with this idea of, well, there's parallel universes. In one universe, the cat is alive, and one universe, the cat is dead. Well, that gets to infinite sets of parallel universes. And then there's this idea of the delayed choice double slit experiment. The point there is after the particle goes through slit A or slit B, it does something else. And you would say, well, if it ends up over here, like 2 steps down the road, let's say the cat goes outside and goes for a walk versus the cat goes to the kitchen. And obviously it can only do that choice if it's still alive and not dead. But the idea is only when somebody observes that subsequent step does the whole path come into existence. And they actually tested this, some physicists in Italy, where the particles went through the double slits, and then they went to a satellite, like, I don't know, 1,000 miles away or something, which takes, a few nanoseconds or milliseconds at the speed of light. And so it wasn't until somebody observed the particle there that it collapsed to go through one slit or the other, as opposed to being a wave. And so now a lot of this reminded me of video games. So earlier I said, quantum entanglement is an optimization or compression technique. Well, quantum indeterminacy is just like why we are able to render a fully 3D worlds like World of Warcraft on my laptop, or even Fortnite on my phone now, because the 3D modeling techniques, they all rely on this cardinal rule, which is you only need to render the pixels that are visible.
Right in front of your face, essentially.
Right in front of your face. And if you turn that way and that way, yeah, you can cache some of the pixels that are around you so that you can render them quickly. And so that's a rendering engine that we have, which takes the mathematical information But each of us has our own rendering engine. So if you and I are playing a game and our avatars are in the same scene, say in World of Warcraft, well, I'm rendering it on my computer and you're rendering it on your computer. And so there's this possibility that what we're seeing may not be the exact same scene. This is a trick we use.
I think that's, it's interesting. You bring that up, and it's like, because in my mind, I see that's exactly what we're doing here on Zoom, right? We're having our avatars are actually speaking to each other to a certain extent.
Right. And it's being rendered where the camera can see, and it's limiting the pixels, and it's compressing. Behind me, there's a wall that's pretty much the same color, right? So it's compressing the pixels and sending them over.
And individually, we have our own processors, and I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, but that ties very much to this idea that our consciousness, may not be seeing the exact same thing, that we may be conscious.
That's what it is.
That are rendering different things. So we do this in video games all the time, where if you're a level 30 character and I'm a level 2 character, I may not see everything in the scene. And the server kind of says, well, he's level 30. Let's show him this hidden object, right?
Right.
Level 2, you don't see it, right? And I don't know that what I'm seeing is different from what you're seeing. And there was actually a set of experiments that was done recently. It was proposed by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist in the 60s named Eugene Wigner. And a lot of these experiments, like the delayed choice, which was proposed by John Wheeler, were all theoretical until the 70s or 80s or 90s, and some till the teens of this century. And this one, they were just able to do it now. And the idea was there was Wigner and Wigner's friend. And he said, well, if we're looking at a set of particles and Wigner looks at it and sees that it collapsed a certain way, but he doesn't tell anybody, and Wigner's friend looks at it before he knows what Wigner observed, will he see something different? Like, will the cat be alive versus dead? They just did this experiment, I think in England, with 5 or 6 sets of entangled particles. It was the first time they could do it. And they found that, in fact, it was possible for the collapse of the particles to happen slightly differently. And so that raises the possibility, just like in video games, that there is no shared rendering of the reality, that it's being rendered by each of us as we observe it. And then as more people observe it, it becomes more and more solid, which now we're in the realm of metaphysics, right? We're outside of physics. We're back to this idea that the world is an illusion or a shared dream, and we're all dreaming it ourselves. Yeah.
And it is and it isn't kind of at the same time, right? I mean, I guess in my mind, there's this mind. I immediately think of Jiddu Krishnamurti. Have you read any of him?
A little bit.
So in it, he talks about where we have relationships with each other, but we're not actually having relationships with each other. We're actually having relationships with our mental image of each other, our mental projection of each other, and our mental interpretation of each other. And then we don't actually commune somehow.
That's right. It's kind of like we're, looking at each other's avatars, which are being rendered in our minds or on our personal computer screen, right? Which really would be our consciousness. And so consciousness is a big area, and it's a big area of debate. I mean, a lot of scientists say either one, ignore it because it's subjective and therefore we can't talk about it in science. The problem is in quantum physics, there's no longer a sense of objective versus subjective. Again, getting back to John Wheeler, he said, we think of science as, okay, you're the scientist outside 20 feet of plate glass watching the experiment and not he says that quantum physics blows that whole notion out of the water. You are a participant in the experiment simply by observing it. So there's no way to be completely separate, from the experiment. So scientists have either written it off, or what's become more popular recently in Silicon Valley, right? We're both here in the Bay Area, is this idea that, consciousness is really just a matter of modeling all of the neurons in the brain. And so if we're able to do that, and we're not able to do that yet because there's so many neurons, and you can't just model the neurons, you have to model the connections, right? And how they fire. So that's a tremendous amount of data. But there are groups that have simulated all the neurons in a rat's brain, for example. Eventually I think that the number ends up being 10 to the 39 if you count all of the human neurons and all of the connections. That if you can just copy that, then you have basically a copy of that person's consciousness. Yeah,
but it's a copy, right? It's not.
Well, there you go. At the beginning of this podcast, you talked about quantum teleportation, which has been in the news a little bit lately, where a Chinese team said they were able to teleport a quantum particle from here up to a satellite without having to go the intervening distance.
Okay. Yeah, I think I saw that.
turns out what they really did was they sent a copy of the information. They didn't actually send the physical particle. It was this quantum state that they copied. Now, if all a particle is a quantum state, then maybe they did accomplish teleportation of a type, right? It's kind of like taking the information in an avatar, de-rendering them from one place to another and re-rendering them somewhere else with
fast travel.
Fast travel. And there's a great science fiction set of books and show on Netflix called Altered Carbon. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yep.
Right. And so there they have this idea of a cortical stack, getting back to the where the Neo's connection was in the Matrix, that they put in, and that all your information of your consciousness is there. But that's how they travel between planets, because it would take too long and be too slow. So they just beam your information to another body into the stack. Now, when you look and say, well, how did he explain how that's done? Turns out they discovered it from some alien technology.
Right, it's always,
and they don't really know how it's done. But that's a great device that they're able to use to be in different bodies. But people in Silicon Valley are taking it seriously, saying digital immortality. Ray Kurzweil and others believe
sign me up.
By 2049, we'll be able to beam ourselves down into a silicon device. And then if that's true, then really our consciousness is information. Now, I think there's an open question whether that's really you or a copy of you. Just like with the quantum teleportation, it's a copy of the information. Just like in biology, we have copies too. They're called clones, or even identical twins, right? They're genetic copies of the genome in this case. But anyone who's known twins knows that they're not the same person.
Right.
Although they may have many similar experiences and shared experiences, they tend to have slightly different personalities. In some cases, they're wildly different personalities. You have an introvert and an extrovert. And so, that gets back to the question of what makes us who we are. And is it just this information that can be copied, or is it, sort of more of an indestructible soul?
Right.
And that's an open question.
Indestructible, non-translatable essence of being.
That's right. And now, I personally think that downloadable consciousness may be possible. And I've spent a lot of time studying the Eastern traditions. And turns out they had this idea of downloading consciousness. At birth, you download into the body, and at death, you upload back to the cloud, whatever the cloud happens to be. But more than that, I mentioned the 6 yogas of Naropa earlier. One of them was dream yoga. Turns out there was a secret 7th yoga, which was a forceful projection of consciousness out of the mind to another entity. And so what would happen is, they kept it secret for obvious reasons, but they said you could project to another biological being. And there was a famous story about a yogi named Marpa who taught it to his son, and his son ended up, his horse ended up, tripping, and he was about to break his neck. So he transferred his consciousness out of his body to a pigeon that was flying in the Himalayas, and that pigeon flew to India, and then he transferred his consciousness to a recently deceased young man's body, which he then, woke up in, and then started to proceed to teach yoga. And then years later, another disciple of his father, Marpa, who's called Milarepa, Tibet's most famous yogi, wanted to teach someone about this. He said, why don't you go study with this guy Tipupa, which means the pigeon saint, who knew all about it in India. So he would send his students over there. Now, is that a story? Did that really happen? According to these traditions, it did, but they have this idea that consciousness can be transferred already, but it needs to have a biological host, right? And so that's where the difference, I think, comes in. And even in some of our science fiction, there's a great TV show called Fringe from a few years ago. I don't know if
I didn't see that one.
Okay, but they had parallel universes. But at one point, Leonard Nimoy played a character named William Bell, and he was going to die, and his consciousness was going to be transferred out. So they said, let's transfer it to this device. Turns out that didn't work. But what did work was he was able to transfer it into the main character, who was a woman, right? So she, started acting like Leonard Nimoy's character, William Bell, and so it was almost like it needed a biological host. And so I have a feeling that there may be more complexities to hosting consciousness than what we think. But in the end, even biology, most of what we take as biology, and the genome was theorized before it was actually found as physical, gets down to information. What is DNA? But a really efficient mechanism for storing all this information about, how the body should develop And there's even evidence that that information can be modified, just like in a computer. And so biological processes happen over time. They may be fractal-like properties. Like there's a great video, getting back to video games, there's a great video game called No Man's Sky, which came out, and actually people liked the idea of the game more than the game itself. But in it, they had 18 quintillion planets.
Right.
Why 18 quintillion? Well, turns out that's the amount of the largest number you can have with 64 bits if they're unsigned, right?
Mm-hmm.
But each of those planets had its own, flora and fauna and trees and all of these things and landscape. Well, the team at the company did not generate, 3D models for 18 quintillion planets. They'd still be at it, right, for many years if they had to do that. But it's procedurally generated following algorithms, and there's a lot of clues in nature that if we want to reproduce what a leaf looks like or what lightning looks like, you follow these kind of fractal algorithms, and it produces much more lifelike, images within video games. And there seems to be evidence that those are the type of algorithms that a lot of what we call biology follows. And so now again, we start to open up and say, well, where's the physical world? It's really a set of information, DNA, and a set of algorithms that are used to generate proteins and to generate cells and all of these things. So it comes back to this idea that, when we say, some people react to this idea and they're like, no way, I'm not some damn Mario Brothers character in a video game. But what I call the great simulation, which would be our reality, would be to today's video games what World of Warcraft and Fortnite and Counter-Strike Go are to Pac-Man, right?
Got it.
It's a whole different level.
Orders of magnitude.
Orders of magnitude, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it, with the way that technology is improving. In fact, one of the reasons I decided to write the book was a couple of years ago. I was playing a virtual reality game. I tried it on with VR glasses. That was a ping pong game. And I started to play, and it just felt so real. Like I was playing an actual ping pong game. The physics engine was so good that it felt like I was actually hitting a ball. It was so realistic, even though the resolution of the opponent it wasn't like a real person. It was like kind of a blocky character, but the responsiveness was so real that by the end of it, I felt like I had played a real game of table tennis. So I set the paddle down on the table and I leaned against the table, which is something I might do. But of course, there was no table, and the paddle fell, which was the controller of the virtual reality. The VR controller, it fell to the floor, and I almost fell over. I had to remind myself. And so if you look at how the technology is improving, in fact, that's the argument that Elon Musk made a few years ago at the Code Conference, which got a lot of attention, was he said 40 years ago we had Pong, which was two squares and a dot. Again, we have ping pong coming up, right? The VR game I saw was sort of the modern version of that.
Yeah.
But then we have 3D virtual worlds with millions of players online. What will happen in another 100 years? What will happen in another 1,000 years? And so the way things are going, it's no longer about pixel resolution. I mean, the resolution is very good. If you watch a movie like Blade Runner 2049 or Star Wars, the special effects generally blend pretty nicely. So the pixel resolution is there. What's not there is the rendering technology. Like for a movie, you can render all the frames once and then you just transmit the pixels and display them. But in a virtual reality game, the reason you need processing power is you have to render it as you move around.
Right.
So it's the rendering and the responsiveness, that of our reactions, and then the interface into the brain, like in the Matrix, that we would need to be able to build something like the Matrix.
Right. And that we would even do that, that I guess I get stuck there a little bit. And why would we do that? Why, like if I were to look at what we were doing now and say we are heading in the direction of, even if we aren't in a simulated reality right now, and we're headed in the direction of simulating a reality, why would we do it? Why wouldn't we just figure out life here and now?
Well, why do we play, Civilization or these other games? Oxford's Bostrom calls them ancestor simulations, where we want to go back and see, what might happen to a particular civilization. Will it develop along a certain way? So this gets back to this issue of, why would we do a simulation? And if we're inside one, why would the people outside the simulation be doing it? It gets back to why we play video games and why do we do simulations in general. So a lot of scientists will simulate a process so that they can see what will happen. And they'll do Monte Carlo simulations of all these different options to figure out, what the weather might be like, or to figure out, where will planets end up. There's this idea of that Stephen Wolfram, a creator of Mathematica, talks about a lot, which is computational irreducibility. And it's this idea that if you want to figure out what's going to happen at step 211, you can't just have a single equation that tells you. You have to actually run that equation 210 times to get there. And so you have to actually run a simulation. And this could be as simple as a lot of simulations have no graphics. You might be simulating the population of fruit flies, right? That's a famous example. Mm-hmm. And you have each step in the simulation is a 1-year cycle. And you say, this is how many of them die, and this is how many of them are born, each year. And you have to run that equation again and again and again to eventually get to, what it might be. And that, it turns out chaos theory is all is a science that's kind of built around this idea of small changes in input conditions can have vastly big outcomes.
Yeah, butterfly effect.
Exactly, which is more popularly called the butterfly effect. But that's because of this computational irreducibility. So sometimes we have to run the simulation to figure out what might happen or what all the possibilities are that might happen. And so, it could be that we're in a simulation where people want to see if meaning people outside the simulation, want to see, what will happen. Will we destroy ourselves? Will we destroy the planet? Mm-hmm. Will we become a spacefaring civilization? In fact, Philip K. Dick, going back to his work, and I interviewed his wife, Tessa B. Dick, as part of my research for this book. And, she told me that he believed we were in a computer-generated reality, and that if you've heard of The Man in the High Castle, which is
saw the first season of it.
Yeah,
on Amazon.
Great show on Amazon now. But it's based on his book from the 1960s, where the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II. So he actually said he remembered that timeline. So he believed there were beings that didn't like the outcome of that timeline, and they rewound the simulation and then went forward where, the Allies won the war. And then, he had many other little smaller examples of where he felt like things had been changed. And he said that he had been told this by beings that were from the future that were running the simulation. Mm-hmm. Were they really from the future? Was he crazy? Was he on drugs? There was lots of different speculation about this. But
probably on drugs back then, right? I mean,
although when I talked to his wife, she said, he didn't really. People say that, but that wasn't their experience at all. Okay. So I think there's something there that our reality may be more complicated than we're thinking. But that would be another reason to run simulations.
That would have been that one specific timeline, though, right? I mean, if we're thinking in terms of infinite timelines, that they would have rewound the clock back to change the reality, but that would still only follow one path.
Right, and the question is, are the other paths, do they exist or not? Because back to our idea, the quantum physics many worlds interpretation, that are there all these parallel universes that have all these branches in them, or there's a debate around this, or are those just probabilities that exist as information? And if it did happen, how would it work? Well, turns out if you want to clone something quickly, that's like a computer process, right? If you want to do a biological process, to clone a tree or to clone a sheep, you still have to grow the cells. It's like a slow process, right? But in computer science, usually there's a processor level command to just copy a bunch of information. Mm-hmm. And so if we were in a universe where we could branch out new parallel universes that are based on the existing universe with different choices, that to me sounds a lot more like a computer-generated reality. That would be the only practical way to accomplish it, because you'd be constantly spinning off with each quantum decision a new universe. Mm-hmm. But perhaps a more likely example is like when we design video games, we lay out the possibilities in the future, but they're just probabilities. And then we go and we look at those and we figure out which one is the best for the AI to choose, like in a chess game or something.
And that one has a limitation, though. There's a specific number of moves that can be done. It's not like it's infinite, like
right. Right. There's limited computing power. And then, there's this question of free will and how infinite is it? Turns out, Stephen Hawking, before he died, said, well, even if there's parallel universes, there's still only a fixed set of particles and only so many configurations that you could put those into. Therefore, it's not really infinite number of worlds. Many of those worlds will be the same because the particle states will be the same. I mean, we're still talking very large numbers here, right? But not necessarily infinity. But that's why I think, a mathematical interpretation of that may be a more realistic option than an actual physical material. There are infinite material physical universes being generated all the time.
Yeah. Or maybe not even generated, maybe just simultaneously existing all at once, time from past and future, throughout.
Right. And could we rewind and could we look at what happened there? So this is another reason, why I wrote the book, because a couple of years ago, I was working with a startup here in Cupertino, Sliver.tv, and they would actually record a video game play from a 3D game like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, where, say you were shooting somebody, and then they could replay that in virtual reality. So you could put on a headset and feel like you were actually on the field, and you could see, this guy shooting that guy, you could see it from his perspective as well, right? So even though it was a 3D world, it was only rendered on a screen, a 2D screen, but now you could put on a virtual reality headset and you could actually be like in League of Legends, you could be on the battlefield and you could see, the various fantasy creatures.
So don't get me wrong. I'm a gamer. I've been a gamer for, kind of all my life, ever since they came out with Atari and Intellivision and all those, right? So I would be down for jumping into a simulated reality just to experience it. I don't know about forever though. I mean,
right.
I haven't figured that out yet, but.
Yeah, maybe you wouldn't want to be there forever, right? You'd want to play it for a period of time. And then, it gets back to the question of, are we here in this physical reality for a period of time? And then do we go somewhere else? And do we come back again? So it gets to, these fundamental questions about why we're here and what this is all about. And certainly it seems like a physical reality to us. But, if you go into Second Life, I can create, or Minecraft, right? I can create some objects using the raw materials that are there, and then you can see those objects. So there's a persistence as long as the servers are still there serving that information, and as long as that information is being rendered. And it's very possible that what we see around us are constructs that have been put there by previous players of the game. That would account for the fact that we have this shared multiplayer, online role-playing game. And that's in the PC version. The NPC version, this could all be an illusion in the sense that there is no even graphically rendered world. We're just information being processed on the server. And this idea goes way back, right? It goes back to Descartes, who said, what if there was an evil demon who was tricking me into thinking that I'm seeing the world around me. And I don't know if that's happening. The only thing I do know is I'm thinking these thoughts, therefore I am.
Right.
The whole rest of the universe could be, some kind of delusion, would be, I guess, the term that he would use.
And he talks about the presence on the Cartesian plane. That's where that comes from, right? Essentially, we are this manifestation of a being in the physical reality.
Yeah, and he had a series of dreams that kind of led him to many of these conclusions, and it's pretty fascinating. I mean, we remember him for obviously the Cartesian coordinate system, and as a mathematician. But I think these more philosophical ideas that he had, were quite interesting, and then we're seeing them revisited now with updated technology. And the idea of a simulated world or an illusory world also goes all the way back to Plato. Plato had the allegory of the cave.
Right.
We were all chained to one side of a cave, and there was an opening in the cave, and there were people outside and things going on, but all we saw were shadows of this, and we took the shadows to be the real world. Well, what if somebody broke the chains and went outside? Well, first of all, he said his eyes might be blinded by the light because he's not used to the sun. But then when he came back and told the rest of us, they'd say, "You're nuts. This is reality here," which sounds a lot like what happens with pretty much any religious tradition and how it starts, right? Somebody peeked outside the cave and they said, "This is what I saw," and then they took a description for that. And at first, people say they're crazy, and then eventually it gets adopted into a set of rules, and then that becomes the reality.
Right. I mean, I just pictured Jesus, right? And I mean, but that poor dude, man, he got himself killed for it, basically, right? And then they said, "Oh yeah, let's make it a religion."
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It seems to be, the origin. So that's why, I think the simulation hypothesis describes that religions really well. Even in the Western traditions, there's this idea that we're judged for our actions here. There's the here and the hereafter. And where's the hereafter? Well, it's not here.
And who's there?
Right? And who's there and who judges you?
Mm-hmm.
In Islam, they have this idea of the recording angels who are writing down all your good deeds and your bad deeds. And turns out recording angels exist in Christianity and Judaism as well. Although there they have the book of life. And in Islam, they have the scroll of deeds. And the idea is you're going to be shown after you die all of your deeds, but not just your deeds, you're going to be shown the impact of those deeds on other people.
Right. The life review.
Sounds a lot like it's the life review, which many people who've had near-death experiences have talked about as a panoramic 3D recording. And they can see and feel from the other person's point of view every action they ever took. I sort of drew the connection when we were building this virtual reality system to replay events and says, wow, that sounds a lot like what we're doing, but in a metaphysical way. Well, that means somebody is recording what's going on now, just like, you and I are recording this podcast or on Twitch, you'll see people streaming their games and then you'll see them record it and save it and put it on YouTube later, right? And so, I don't think you need 14 billion recording angels, to record all our good deeds and bad deeds. You just need a algorithmic process that's recording things and a semi-smart AI that's determining whether those are good deeds or bad deeds. And just putting them all in the cloud server into the database so that you can re-render them as necessary for the life review down the road. And I don't take necessarily, any particular religious position here. I just say, if you look at all the religions, right? Look at what they're saying in common. And then you look at what science is discovering and some of the things we cannot explain on the scientific side, that these things all make sense under this guise or this model of a simulated computer-generated reality using much more sophisticated computers than what we think of as computers today.
Right. I mean, it seems to me the first step would be to hack it. To figure out how to hack that,
Right. And some people say, well, what are the cheat codes and how do I hack it? And that's an interesting question. And there's been some, there was a famous hacker who's a creator of this self-driving car called Comma.ai. And he gave a talk at South by Southwest about, we'd like to hack the simulation and start a church based on this idea of hacking out of the simulation. There was Elon Musk was on a show talking about self-driving cars, and a MIT professor who does a podcast on AI. And at the end of the podcast, after they were talking about AI, he asked Elon Musk, he said, well, what question would you ask if we were able to create AGI or artificial general intelligence, like a really smart AI? And his answer was, what's outside the simulation, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
That he'd want to ask. So maybe we're getting there. There was an article just recently about groups of scientists that have been trying to simulate the physical universe. And using AI, they were able to predict properties that they never programmed into the simulation, and they don't know how it's picking up this information about.
It's like what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know, and it's like the AI would just iterate over it, and it would produce what we don't know all of a sudden.
Yeah, and it would make inferences, and that's why there's a resurgence of AI. Is that it used to be that AI was all about rule sets and algorithms and programming, and that wasn't working so well. But then there was a resurgence of AI with machine learning, which was all about data and letting the AI figure out the relationships mathematically without having to have rules that say if this then that, if this then that, because otherwise you have to have too many rules and there's always exceptions to the rules. That it's a matter of just letting the neurons perceive, or the virtual neurons in this case, and then tuning the whole network based on these weights. And some people think, obviously that was based on the idea of neurons in the brain. Is that all there is to consciousness and perception, or is there something else? And that's an open question in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it is a mystery, right? The depth of the mystery is just mind-boggling, almost as if there is no real answer, or an answer maybe isn't what we're trying to come to.
Yeah, and then maybe there will always be, more things.
Just the question, maybe just as a question, existence as a question mark.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that, when I was back studying at MIT, my professors would always say, well, what we have as science is not really the truth. It's a set of models about how the universe works. And if those models are useful, we use those to predict things, and we use those to kind of understand how things work. And, just like Newtonian mechanics was a model, and then they found that didn't really work at high speeds. So then a relativistic model came about, and they found that didn't really seem to explain the behavior of subatomic particles. And then quantum physics came about as a model. And, there are other models that people are suggesting, string theory, et cetera. But I find that the simulation hypothesis as a model, that we live in an information-based reality that's being rendered for each of us, may end up coming closer to explaining these things than a lot of other models that are out there. And we'll see how that evolves over time. But it may take, a long time to figure that out. But the basic simulation argument, going back to Bostrom, was that if anyone ever gets to that point, then it's more likely we are already in a simulation than not.
Right.
And I'm saying we can get there in 100 years, maybe.
Totally.
And if we can get there in 100 years, it's very likely that someone has already gotten there. Certainly with much more sophisticated computers than we have.
Over the billions of years of existence in the universe, essentially, right? Many times over, people could evolve to that level.
That's right. Yeah, there could be, and many different levels. And there are people who think that, there have been beings on the earth much longer than we think. And so there's a lot of controversy around that. Have there been civilizations that have gotten destroyed and that we can no longer find any traces of because they're at the bottom of the ocean, which is probably the least explored area, on Earth, less even so than the moon in terms of like really mapping it out and really knowing what's down there.
Graham Hancock comes to mind. Have you heard of that guy?
That's right. Yeah. Graham Hancock. And then there's the group, there was a BU geologist, Robert Schoch, I think was his name.
Robert Schoch went to the pyramids and saw the whole the rainfall on the enclosure around the Sphinx, and it was like, well, that's 100,000 years old at least.
Right, exactly. Much older than the archaeologists would say, but the archaeologists are always pushing back timelines, even for civilization in the Americas, right? I think the theory was that humans came over across the Bering Strait during the last ice age, and there were no people here before that. But Graham Hancock's latest book, I think, talks about discoveries of archaeologists of things that were here that are much older than the last time frame of that bridge. And then if you look at the DNA as well, you find that there's different groups that may have different ancestry than what they thought. And so anyway, this gets back to, we don't even know the full history of our planet.
Right.
But if it's a simulated world, who's to say that that's even a real history? One of the stages, the 10 stages I lay out in the book, is this idea of false memories, right? And now we're getting back to Blade Runner and this idea that, Sean Young's character thought she was human, and she told Harrison Ford's character, about the spider when she was a little girl, and he said those are all implanted memories, right? And if you can implant memories, you can have, any history you want. And even Stephen Hawking said that, when he found that certain information was lost and out of black holes, that determinism breaks down. And if determinism breaks down, you can't be sure of history. You can't be sure what actually happened. And so it's all very possible that what we think of as history is a part of a simulation and a timeline that was put out there for us to see how we would react to that timeline. It's tough to say at this point.
Yeah, lots of unanswered questions in general, right? And then we get off the Zoom and we go into our worlds and interact with life and just go about like it's normal, even though it could be a totally simulated reality, and in terms of numbers, it sounds like from your perspective, that's what it is. Yeah.
Right. But, would it make a difference, I guess, is the question in our lives. And, I, for one, would like to know, if I'm in a video game, what are the rules of the game? What are the quests and achievements that I'm here for? But probably the best advice, there's a MIT professor, a physicist named Max Tegmark, who was on a panel, and he wrote a book called The Mathematical Universe, but he was on a panel and they were talking about simulation. And his advice was, my advice is live an interesting life so that the simulators don't shut you down. Right? That may be the best advice of all.
Right. That's a good one, I think. Okay. Well, in terms of the simulation, I guess. You know what? What do you think about what's coming up in the future? I look at the decades coming up, and it seems, man, artificial intelligence and this Internet of Things, and then the cryptocurrency potentially revolutionizing the banking system or economics and as we know it, right? I mean, what do you see? What are your feelings on the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be an ever accelerating pace of this. I'm a big fan of cryptocurrency and have been investing in it for a while through the boom and bust cycles. And there are a few. Like when I first started buying cryptocurrency, I used to go downtown Mountain View and I would take out $100 from the Bank of America and I'd give it to a guy who would literally give me one Bitcoin, back then. And I think, the technology has a lot of promise in this idea of a decentralized world. I think more and more things are becoming digital, and that's going to be the trend. And that's digital money. And if you think about it, most of what we think of as money is digital already, even without cryptocurrency. It's just numbers in a database somewhere
right.
that are being kept and that are being transferred back and forth. Between different, it used to be that gold was transferred between different countries physically, and they even stopped doing that. Even before they went off the gold standard, they would just kind of keep track of, okay, these are the bars in New York, and we need to ship this many to Germany, and we'll just put them over here on this side of the, the reserve.
Right.
Stopped doing the physical transfer long ago.
But then it goes, we lost a couple gold bricks along the way. What happened there, right?
Yeah, well, there's that. Yeah.
And then introduce blockchain, and all of a sudden that problem seems to go away.
Right. So you have a shared ledger that everybody can agree upon. I think that has a lot of promise. But I think in the decades ahead, quantum computing will redefine how we think of as computers. There was actually an article I wrote a couple of years ago for Hacker Noon. I think it was probably my most popular post ever. That one and the simulation hypothesis, it was how I cornered the Bitcoin mining market using a quantum computer. And the idea was, cryptocurrency is based on this idea of solving these mathematical problems. Could you use a quantum computer to kind of solve the mining problem or the hashing problem?
Seems like you could.
Eventually you could, but then there are quantum safe algorithms as well that, some other, I don't know if it'll be Bitcoin long-term. It may just end up being a different blockchain technology that uses different algorithms. But I think we're definitely headed in that direction. It used to be that any one government could shut it down. In fact, the crash of 2013 or 2014 after the rise from like $100 to about $1,000 in Bitcoin, and then there was a crash, occurred primarily because China was clamping down on cryptocurrency. And then there was this whole Mt. Gox situation as well. So it was a series of things. But today you hear governments clamping down on cryptocurrency all the time, and it doesn't quite seem to upset the markets the way it used to. And it's because there's a global market now. You've got Korea, you've got Japan. You keep hearing about India, they're going to outlaw cryptocurrency, and then they're not. And in Russia, they had outlawed it, and now Putin likes it, and now he doesn't like it. It just goes back and forth. But I do think that's a pretty big trend.
Okay. And what else? I mean, artificial intelligence. I mean, it seems like we're advancing pretty fast at a breakneck pace even.
Yeah, I think, AI is going very fast, but I think there may need to be another wave of AI. Like the first wave was this expert systems and algorithms, and then that kind of died out. We now have this wave that's been going on for the past decade or so, and maybe less than that, maybe the past 6 years, of machine learning, deep learning, data-based AI. But really, if you look at self-driving cars, for example, they use both data-based AI, but there's also heuristics that are involved as well. So it's a combination of the two. I have a feeling that we'll probably hit a wall at some point. You never know that beforehand, right? I mean, if you go back to the 80s, everyone thought we were going to have, AGI within a decade or two, and then it didn't happen, right? They thought we'd have a thinking computer very soon, and same thing happens here. So it may flounder for a decade or two, but I think we're definitely on the path where we're going to have intelligent agents now that maybe they're not quite human, but they're quite intelligent at performing specific tasks. And that trend, I think, is irreversible at this point.
Yikes.
That will definitely happen where you have AI that's better at certain tasks than humans. Absolutely. But will we have human-like AGI? I think it will hit a wall. There'll be a decade or two of kind of a dip, and then there'll be a new set of techniques that are built on top of the existing techniques. And that's why I give, the 2100 to 2200 dates as the time when I think we'll have AI that could be fully realistic NPCs on this path to the simulation.
And how do we make it that far? Because I would love to see that. That would be pretty great.
Well, yeah. I mean, we've made it this far, right?
Well, I guess we could download our consciousness into a simulation until
that's right.
we figure out a way to keep
we
us
will still be here, or we
alive
could be
forever.
playing different characters in the future. So it just
Right. Wouldn't matter. Yeah, I mean, it draws back to that whole idea of like, if we are in a simulated reality, then that must mean that I stepped into it on purpose, and that everything is going according to plan. So I should just sit tight and enjoy the ride, maybe.
Right, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you, as a player, just like I can decide in World of Warcraft whether to kill this guy or to be his friend, you can still make choices in the simulation. So it may not be that it's predetermined. It may be like in video games. We have paths that can be taken and choices that can be made, but it's not infinite choice, even though it might seem like it. Maybe there are certain choices, and that determines what type of game.
That'd be a hell of a game if somebody could make that happen.
Yeah, right. Definitely. It would be.
Right on, Riz. Well, it was good talking to you. I very much enjoyed it. I don't know what time it is. So
yeah,
it's getting close.
I need to get going here. But yeah, this has been a great conversation. It's been a lot.
I've enjoyed it myself. So hopefully we can have you again. I'll pay attention, check out all your articles on Hacker Noon and all that stuff, and maybe we'll chit chat in the future.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, Riz.
For that. Okay, thanks.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.
That was Riz Virk, author of The Simulation Hypothesis. In addition to being a contributing writer on Hacker Noon, he's a successful entrepreneur, angel investor, best-selling author, video game industry pioneer, and independent film producer. You can find him online at www.zenentrepreneur.com. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes and YouTube and follow us on social media. You can find the Hacker Noon podcast at podcast.hackernoon.com and keep up with what's going on in the community at community.hackernoon.com. Until the next time, I'm Derek Bernard. Thanks for tuning in.